What ended up happening is that Evo consolidated a lot of power, knocked out a lot of indigenous movements that had supported him initially, but now were critical of him concentrating so much power.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. Israeli government propaganda tries to reframe last month's violence as Israeli government response to Hamas missiles. Of course, it all started before that, with the Israeli attempt to ethnically cleanse Sheikh Jarrah and impose ever more restrictions on movement around Al-Aqsa. Now, after the ceasefire, after all the Hamas missiles have stopped, Israelis again are brutalizing Palestinians. Here's one small example during an attempt to have a marathon in Jerusalem. Here the runners leave from Sheikh Jarrah on their way to Silwan. And here in Silwan, police fire tear gas canisters and stun grenades at the competitors participating in the marathon, breaking up the event.
بشكل وحشي قمعونا بشكل وحشي إلقاء قنابل صوتية في داخل خيمة اعتصام.
We saw the video on the pages of the Palestine Chronicle. Now from Middle East Eye about the rally in Washington, D.C.
Achieving change. I want you to believe in yourself. I want you to believe in the power of your voice. I want you to believe that we can make our brothers and sisters in Palestine proud of us. We are proud of them. What we are like to do, I see no politicians come forward, not hesitating to speak for Palestinian rights. We've seen this, and we've seen more.
This is a photo from the event. This one I thought was Photoshopped, but it's real. Someone had set off smoke with the colors red and green, and Nuha Mara Roof snapped a photo just at the right time. You can see the smoke machine in this video. Palestinian Samaya Awad tells how things are changing.
There's definitely been a major shift in the United States just in the last 5 years when it comes to Palestine activism. So for one thing, when I was in college, the number of students involved in doing anything related to Palestine was under 10 actively. And all of them were viciously attacked, and doing this work they knew came with many compromises and many threats. And yet, when you look at today what's happening, and the number of people involved in the movement, the number of people eagerly wanting to learn more, to connect the dots between Palestine and numerous other movements for social justice in the US, from movements against police brutality, so the movement for Black Lives, to climate justice, to immigrant rights, to anti-war work, it's really astounding. And the fact that we can talk about Palestinians, we can talk about Palestine without having to qualify it, without having to respond to the same threats of or accusations of anti-Semitism, terrorism charges. That's not to say those are completely gone, far from it, they still exist. But what we're seeing now is that Palestine is increasingly not a fringe issue. It's actually entering the mainstream, and entering the mainstream on Palestinian terms. We're seeing the words ethnic cleansing used more and more. We're seeing the words apartheid, and even settler colonialism, not quite, but I think we're moving in that direction. And the fact that this is happening in the United States, the world's largest imperial power, the world's superpower still, and Israel's main backer is really, really significant. I mean, who would have thought that on the floor of Congress, you could have members of the US House of Representatives talking about Palestine, talking about Palestinian freedom, talking about the need to end occupation, the need to end police brutality against Palestinians. Last week, when Rashida Tlaib confronted Joe Biden on the tarmac in Michigan, I mean, who would have thought this could happen 5 years ago? So I think what the Democratic Party establishment is seeing is that they're not going to be able to go back to the status quo. They're going to have to figure something out. And it's true, they're going to do everything they can to re-establish some sort of center-right position. There are over 200 bills in the United States trying to suppress Palestine advocacy. 23% of those laws have passed. They're actually in effect. And in New York, which is where I am, Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, a few years ago passed an anti-boycott executive order. And what that meant was, if you, as an individual or as an institution or organization that receives funding from New York State, if you engage in any form of boycott against Israel, any form, even if it's tangential, meaning you invite someone to speak that engages in boycotts of Israel, you will lose that funding. You will be put on a blacklist and you will not get funding or support from the New York State. Now, this is a huge violation of constitutional law, and people have pointed that out. But what Andrew Cuomo is doing is something that other states are trying to do or have done. There's a reason why the US government is waging an all-out war on BDS, because it's going to hurt its own profits. It's not just about Israel, but it's about US economy, US profits in the military-industrial complex. So Caterpillar is one example, because Israel uses those bulldozers to demolish Palestinian homes, to build the apartheid wall, etc. Boeing is another example, because they supply the aerial weaponry that Israel uses to oppress Palestinians and to maintain its blockade on Gaza. All of these corporations aren't just involved in Israel. They're involved in a number of other states that are surveilling, oppressing their own domestic and indigenous populations. So Elbit Systems builds the checkpoints, the surveillance and technology on the checkpoints in Palestine, in the West Bank, between Palestinian cities. And it also actually built the US-Mexico border technology and surveillance that's used against immigrants and refugees on the US-Mexico border. So there's a lot of connections to be drawn, and I think that's why BDS is so important, because it helps us draw these connections between corporations that are complicit in human rights violations and crimes against humanity all around the world. The reality is, there's more of us in the streets, yes. There's more people talking about anti-Zionism, yes. There are more people identifying with Palestinians in their fight for liberation, that's true. But there's still a $3.8 billion package that's going to Israel every single year from the US government. So I think the next step is, how do we take all of these shifts and how do we create something concrete to stop the material support for apartheid? How do we defund Israel's settler colonial project? And then how do we take that and incorporate it into the broader fight against the US military-industrial complex?
Now to a protest that succeeded. Activists blocked the port of Oakland to an Israeli ship from its Zim Line Corporation, so it could not unload. The effort was organized by Arab Resource and Organizing Center, AROC. Zim sent out this notice: due to operational constraints and long delays in the Port of Oakland. And in order to meet scheduled departures in the Far East, we will be calling on other U.S. West Coast ports until further notice. According to AROC, similar protests are planned for ports in Seattle, Los Angeles, New York, and Vancouver, Canada. And this from South Africa.
Well, mostly I stand here as a father. My son today is turning 4 years old, Mandela Ikram Mandela.
Did you hear the word Mandela? The speaker is the grandson of the famous South African liberator, Nelson Mandela.
And to continuously witness children in Palestine being shot in the back, being put in prison, it really pains our hearts as fathers, as parents, and also as citizens in the Republic of South Africa that have witnessed such brutalities in our past. And we are here today as a family with my wife, my father-in-law, as well as my mother-in-law, to say that we will not rest until we see a free Palestine in our lifetime. And we will speak against the brutality that is meted out against innocent children and women in Palestine. And that is why we are here united as a family today to charge forward with what Madiba once said, that our freedom is incomplete until the Palestinians are free.
And this photo from London, where an estimated 180,000 turned out for Palestine. You recall an event we publicized last month called Supporters of Despots Don't Belong in Left Spaces, an exposure of some of the so-called anti-imperialists. One of the speakers was Linda Quiquivix. We're going to have a bit of what she had to say, some understanding of the overall problem, and some examples from Bolivia and other countries.
Mother Earth does a lot of work in creating the world, and what capitalism needs to do is devalorize most of the work so that it can extract profit. And so then here, if we understand capitalism in this way, in this deep, deep way, we can understand how, for example, there can be racialization under capitalism, where enslaved people are not understood as anyone whose labor time is equivalent to someone else's, who is not a property owner, who cannot engage in contracts. It would be the master engaging in contracts over the enslaved person's work. Enslaved people have been treated very much like objects of nature, and therefore devalorized under capitalism. And this logic continues in a lot of ways, although there's been struggle to valorize more and more workers. And so here we can have at least two different definitions of what capitalism is. And I see in a lot of movement spaces more definitions that are more focused on the injustice of those human laborers not getting the full worth of their labor, that it goes to the boss. And so then there's a movement that seeks redistribution of those wages back to the laborer. But it's still continues having this split over the human and the non-human, over whose work is valorized and whose work is not valorized. And then there are broader conceptions of what capitalism is, and a lot of these come from indigenous movements all over the world, but not just. A lot of feminist movements as well, especially eco-feminists, that talk about the problem of capital isn't whether it's redistributing profits equitably, it's that it even creates this division over objects and subjects, over valorization and devalorization, and which is creating then a climate catastrophe that we see now, the massive ravaging and pillaging of Mother Earth, and of course of colonized peoples who are understood to be closer to nature and not very close to the modern human, under humanism, under Western ideas. And so then that's important, I think, when we talk about an anti-capitalist politics, have shared concepts, or at least debates over our working definitions of how we understand the world to be functioning, how we understand capitalism to work. In terms of imperialism or anti-imperialist politics, which we see a lot, especially in critiques of the United States, rightly so. The US is an imperialist power in that it expands outside of its borders in order to continue extracting profit from the world. Before the US, there was Britain, that was the great imperialist power. And France was part of that too. Many European countries were imperialist powers. It's interesting too to understand how we use this term imperialism as well, because there are debates that talk about how imperialism, if we're using it to talk about a nation state, a specific nation state's activities outside its borders, then we might not. Then we might be missing how nation states work together for capital, for global capital. This was actually something in the early 1970s that Huey Newton, co-founder of the Black Panther Party, developed in his theorizations. He said, we used to be Black nationalists first, and then we realized that we needed to connect internationally. So we became Black internationalists. But then we realized that empire has gotten global, that the US is an empire and its reach is global, and it's far bigger than just the United States with this military machine. It's really functioning for the benefit of global capital. And if that's the case, we can never create a Black nation state. And so then they moved from being Black internationalists to intercommunalists, talking about organizing in terms of communities that are networked all over the world, not necessarily through the nation state container. And so then it's been really interesting to see this debate play out in recent decades, especially with discussions about neoliberalism. Having many definitions. One that seems to speak to me the most is one that talks about how sovereignty has shifted away from the nation state, if it ever really had it. And the nation state is now playing an administrative role, a managerial role, kind of like an overseer role for global capital. The Zapatistas in Chiapas in Mexico have an analysis about the global plantation, about how nation states are serving as overseers and in their borders. It's a plantation that functions for global capital. And that's a great reason why they also see, like the Black Panthers in the 70s saw, that it's not possible to take the state if we're really going to be a leftist movement, an anti-capitalist movement, because the state international system functions in a way of agreements, of international agreements, and those agreements move forward the imperatives of capital. And so it's been really fascinating to see movements like the Zapatistas grow and inspire so much of the world since their uprising in 1994, and especially in the years that followed, because they tried a lot of things. They tried to create another political movement to take the dominant ruling dictator party, the PRI, out of office. They tried to get into negotiations with the government. These things didn't work until finally, the stage that they're at now, that they've been on since 2005, which you can find in the Sixth Declaration of the Lacandon Jungle, where they invite anyone. They're like, we're tired. We're not going to talk to the above anymore. We're going to talk to movements from below who are dedicated or who are committed to creating a world where many worlds fit, where there isn't going to be one way imposed on everybody. And they take very seriously the idea of the below, of believing that people themselves can govern, that we're all equally intelligent, that we all have the capacity. We just need each other's superpowers, as a collective, to be super strong. And so what they've done that's been, I found very helpful, is that they have split the left. They call themselves the left from below, in distinction from the left from above, where the left from above is that left that doesn't really believe that everyday people can govern themselves, believes instead that there needs to be an educated elite that knows better and will impose socialism for example, on everybody else, imposing sameness on everybody else, rather than respecting difference. And so I think with that, I can leave it there, and then we might be able to have some more conversations that harken back to these terms, and hopefully what I've presented has been useful.
Maybe you could talk a little bit more about Latin America, maybe about the resistance from the indigenous and grassroots movements in the countries, how their version of left may differ from what the authoritarians in those areas believe.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of the impacts on indigenous movements in Latin America, this also entails us talking a bit more about what we mean by indigenous. Do we mean indigenous identity? Do we mean indigenous way of being in the world? Meaning that, for example, there isn't a human, non-human split with measures of value, superiority, inferiority. There's a more holistic, more respectful engagement of difference. That's one way of understanding indigeneity, although indigeneity, of course, is not homogenized either. So in Bolivia, this is a really great example in that the movements that brought Evo Morales to power, many of them were indigenous movements. And it was supposed to be a strategic move to have Evo as president of the country to be able to empower the movements from below some more. What ended up happening is that Evo consolidated a lot of power, knocked out a lot of indigenous movements that had supported him initially, but now were critical of him concentrating so much power, and was able to co-opt other movements into his administration or into his regime. And of course, the United States, when it comes to Latin America, as is the case in many places all over the world, but in the case, for sure, Bolivia is always waiting in the wings to seize upon any opportunity of a crack when movements against capital, for example, arise so strongly. And what happened with Evo was the consolidation of power that he undertook, the destruction of many of the movements that brought him into power were then weakened or destroyed, right? Made it so that when he wanted to continue being president and extending his regime longer and longer and longer, it ended up really opening up these cleavages from before, and now he was weaker, which then allows the United States to seize and of course fascist elements in the country to seize power and have him fleeing the country in a coup. And so then that all depends, like in Bolivia, that's a really great case study of what do we mean by indigenous movements, because Evo Morales very much identifies as an indigenous person, but there are many critiques of his administration as more being like a superficial identitarian indigeneity rather than a different way of being, a different way of living in the world, which is what many indigenous movements there and all over the continent understand. And I think that the discussion that I was offering before about how under capitalism, the tree does not get understood as a dignified being in its own right on an equal level with us all in terms of that dignity and that worth. That is actually something that can be traced to debates between Native Americans and Marxists. And there's actually an edited volume called Marxism and Native Americans, or Churchill's there, Russell Means, that talk about how many Native Americans have not been able to work with Marxists if those Marxists believe that it's the working class that is the valorized class. And then therefore you can have pipeline construction, for example, with Standing Rock. We saw labor, the AFL-CIO, supporting the construction of the pipeline because it was going to create jobs. This is an old fight and it still continues. And so then understanding that there are battles of indigeneity and with indigenous movements, I think it's really important to understand that, to understand the nuance of what's at stake, that it's other worlds that are at play here, not just fights between identities. In Mexico, a case I'm very familiar with because I accompany the Zapatistas, there we have Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who has masterfully put on this indigenous symbolism throughout his entire administration, beginning with his inauguration and on, while he's creating these mega projects, the Maya Train, the Trans-Isthmus Corridor, that is going to destroy indigenous communities and destroy so much of the land in the south of Mexico. So he's doing this all at the same time, and it's shocking to see, but not surprising, that movements that oppose him, movements like the Zapatistas, get called tools for imperialism, for the United States, which is what sadly we see happening all over the world. Anytime there is a so-called progressive government that gives lip service against the United States, then immediately many anti-imperialists want to mark that regime as somehow leftist, somehow anti-capitalist, even if they're not. It's this focus, this myopic focus on the United States as the one imperial actor, rather than a logic of global capital. That is what they focus on, is the specific country or the one singular actor, rather than the logic that then makes this nonsensical argument be able to be realized, and of course confuses so many folks. It's really fascinating to me how a lot of anti-imperialists in the United States are so good at understanding the nuance of US electoral politics, and then, very critical of someone like Barack Obama, rightly so. This is someone who empire really needed to salvage its image after 8 years with George W. Bush, when there was so much heartbreak within the United States and outside the United States, and a crisis of faith in the United States. And then here comes Barack Obama, the first Black president, who then for empire gives empire a lot more play now, a lot more love than before. But many anti-imperialists in the United States understand this as a game. They're able to understand the nuance in the United States, but it's fascinating to see how they don't understand or want to understand or investigate the nuance outside of the United States within countries, because so many of these power plays, these seductive psychological plays that empire makes, are at play outside of the United States too. And I will just say also, when with Syria, I was not surprised at how so many of the anti-imperialists, so-called left, completely ignored or just dismissed those really beautiful councils that were being created spontaneously on the ground by Syrians in a very autonomous fashion, where they needed to learn how to run that. Like, they liberated their own village, and then they needed to learn how to run it. Like, how does the electricity get here? How do we make bread, etc. That is the work of autonomy. But I saw so many people on the left from above, of course, wanting to completely just dismiss them as insignificant, because really they're just so focused on a politics from above, this geopolitical playing, where they don't understand how powerful we all can possibly be, and how powerful the below is in a very collective fashion. And so then this whole thing ends up being like a chessboard above, without understanding broader exercises of power and the potentials that can come from the below. I will leave it there.
And we want to remember an attack by the Israeli military on the U.S. Navy. Yes, you heard that right. I'm talking about the Israeli attack June 8th, 1967, on the USS Liberty.
Warm day, sunshine was shining brightly out, nice breeze blowing, and I distinctly remember hearing the flag flapping in the wind.
Coming to go back to the Trescom area, I stepped out on deck, that plane came by and looked right in the cockpit. He waved, I waved. That's how close they were, and they knew who we were.
Well, all the recon flights that they had that morning, looking at our ship for approximately 6 to 7 hours, they had a good idea of what they were doing, and they hit us hard and fast with everything they had.
Israel paid compensation, but it never came clean about who ordered that attack on the Liberty and why. And no U.S. president ever pressed them upon it. Now, some think that's because of the power of the pro-Israel lobby. That's part of it, but another part, a bigger part, has to do with what Israel showed it could do in June 1967. It showed itself for the first time as a possible imperial asset. Just like the Russian Cossacks were the enforcers for the Russian Tsar, Israel could be the enforcer for the U.S. empire. The attack on the USS Liberty shows that while the powers that be wave the American flag by the dozens, when it comes right down to it, they prefer the warmonger imperialist alliance to the lives of U.S. sailors. For more about this, see the website usslibertyveterans.org. That's our program for today. Out in the street, folks, it's time to act. This has been Stanley Heller for The Struggle.